Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our Powering the Vehicles of the Future breakout session. My name is Carrie Ann and I will be your facilitator for the next 30 minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some quick housekeeping items. If you'd like to turn your camera on during the discussion, please do so. However, you are not able to unmute yourselves, so feel free to engage in the public session chat on the right side of your screen. We also ask that during the Q&A portion of the discussion to include your name, organization, and question in the public session chat, which is again to the right of your screen. With that, in the next 30 minutes, we'll discuss the transformational nature in which our automotive industry will go through in the next 25 years and examine the infrastructure that needs to be in place in order for autonomous vehicles to be implemented. In a few moments, we'll hear from our experts about the critical role that hardware will play in the future of transportation and how Canada can play a leading role in the automotive industry. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our session speakers. First up, we have Tom Conway, Director of Automotive Products at ARM, and our second speaker is Tarek Raymond, Senior Strategy Manager at TELUS Automotive IoT. Thank you both for being here and leading this important discussion today. You may now take the virtual stage.
Great, thanks, Carrie Ann. So, hi everyone, I'm Tom Conway. I work for ARM, based in the UK. Inside ARM, I lead the automotive product management team. So my team and I look after positioning all of ARM's products to the global market, focused on the automotive segment. Hopefully some of you will know that ARM supplies intellectual property, semiconductor IP to the top 15 automotive chip makers and a wide range of other silicon providers, people who build SoCs focused on the automotive market. So I'm glad to be here today.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. I'm Tarek Raymond. I'm a senior strategy manager with TELUS, and for those who may not be aware, TELUS is a top 3 telco operator in Canada. At TELUS, I manage the product development roadmap and portfolio for the Internet of Things group within, or IoT group within TELUS, but I also wear a product hat where I own the product portfolio for automotive and eSIM. Happy to be here.
Great, so let's dive into that. Thinking about the topics we were given, looking at the changes we see in transportation, in vehicles specifically. From my perspective, from ARM's perspective, we're seeing a huge growth in the electronic content arriving in vehicles. But from my perspective, even more interesting is the renewed focus we see from automotive manufacturers regarding the importance of the electronics in their vehicle. Certainly we're seeing, and I hope you're seeing a similar effect, where vehicle OEMs are looking more and more about how they differentiate with how the electronics in the vehicle differentiates them from their competitors, and they are investing more and more in those, in taking ownership of the electronics in their vehicles, controlling that, managing that, owning that area of innovation. And from my perspective, that's a really interesting change in behavior we've seen from OEMs across the globe, specifically in North America. In general, I think the move to electric vehicles, and there's discussion about truly autonomous vehicles, which we can have a bit of in this session, the general trends towards electrification, towards connected cars, which I'm sure Tarek will mention a bit more, that leads to huge amounts of growth in the overall semiconductor content in vehicles, but perhaps more importantly, in the focus that OEMs have on managing their supply chain and looking for that innovation. I think that's a key area where some of the people on the call will be able to jump in as they see that change in behavior with those large automotive OEMs. Tarek, do you want to say a few words on that?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I've actually observed a lot of what you just mentioned, on the ground here in Canada, specifically around electrification. But when we sit back and think about what is the role that we can play in this market, I think you find out pretty early on during your research that there are hardly any big logo auto OEMs based in Canada. Of course, a couple of them may have manufacturing plants, but there are none, uh, at least no major OEMs that are headquartered in Canada. And that has historically been part of the problem of how Canada has not been able to play as much of a role that we wanted to in that space. But things are exciting, or things are taking a turn towards more promising prospects, especially with I would say, the evolution of the communications backbone. So if you just look at connectivity within vehicles, historically, there've been more, large OEMs partner with a global MNO, let's say the Vodafones and the AT&Ts of the world, and roam permanently. But right now, if you look at the what's happening within the vehicle and all these devices that extract data and transmit that data, and now increasingly have to do or perform some kind of action with that data. Due to that activity, the level of bandwidth and throughput and latency requirements are evolving within these OEMs, and that cannot really take place or does not have a future in this permanent roaming world. So we're starting to see a lot of these OEMs move to localized connectivity within Canada. So the Canadian telco operators are getting a lot of attention and traction with these OEMs. And sure, it's just connectivity, but the future of connectivity is they need this connectivity to power all sorts of applications and use cases within the vehicle. Most of these use cases, for their own benefit, are OEM managed and built applications, but it also opens up the space for third-party applications. And that's an area I think Canada can really shine from a startup ecosystem standpoint. And if you look at it, if you look at some of these use cases, it's not just the new applications, it's also the kind of applications that would evolve from there. So not just simple connectivity, there could be applications that also contribute to this EV charging ecosystem. Electric vehicles have a very different way, the way they're serviced, and the way even tow trucks have a very different procedure on how they actually get and move electric vehicles from one point to another. So I think for Canada, it would be mostly an ecosystem play rather than a pure OEM play. And some of the areas, like I mentioned, is participating in that EV charging infrastructure, which is expected to be built and managed in Canada by Canadians, with a bit of help, hopefully, from the government. But also, I do see a lot of prospects around data monetization with all these sensors and devices collecting with all the data. There's definitely a benefit with all the insights that can be derived from this data, and also this whole third-party application ecosystem.
That's great. There's a really interesting point down that path, Tarek. I wonder, you and I may disagree about exactly how or where data will be shared back. We can entirely agree there's going to be a huge amount of data. One of the challenges I suspect that OEMs and their suppliers will face is how they view vehicles as perhaps they're the most complex IoT device in the world, but they will have to make choices about how they interpret some of that data locally, and how they make a point of interpreting that, how much they send back to the system. So there'll be interesting. So I think there'll be interesting questions will evolve about how much data is processed locally in the vehicle, then how some aspects or some conclusions from that data are sent back over the infrastructure. But there will certainly be a huge step change in the amount of data being processed, the amount of data needing to be backhauled to enable those future vehicles and enable some of those innovative functions. And this is where OEMs, I believe, will look to differentiate to supply ultimately consumers with those different experiences.
Right. So Tom, speaking of OEMs, I wonder what your thoughts are about the existing global chip shortage that's in the news every other day these days. Is that something that consumers or even folks in the hardware ecosystem should be worried about?
I don't think worried about's the right term. I think awareness is the interesting factor for me. It's been very interesting to see a renewed level of awareness of the significance of electronics in automobile production. Some people throughout the supply chain will no doubt have known this for many years and have been very clear on this. I read an interesting article from one of the market analysts where it put together a discussion about the life cycle of components, the idea of just-in-time car manufacturing on the day to spending some weeks to planning supply lines to SoC production. So I'm going the wrong way. SoC production taking many months, and so you have to be careful how you manage that supply line, those supply chains. It's, as I say, interesting to see the significance of electronics in the vehicle creating production line stops, which is very, very bad news. And what we're seeing is automotive OEMs taking a huge amount of interest, not just in inventory management, which is a classic response to these types of discussions, but thinking more about how they architect their vehicles, how they architect the electronics in their vehicles overall, to then think about how they manage that supply chain to have more resiliency, to be able to move between one or multiple suppliers with more ease in the future. I'm not suggesting that's easy by any means, just people are starting to be much more aware of their how those supply chains impact manufacture.
Sure. I mean, from a telecom standpoint, us being primary providers of telecom services, I honestly didn't think that there would be anyone on our end would be spending sleepless nights, but it was actually pretty insightful to me that, as soon as this was, it was all over the news about this chip shortage, we had some of our planning folks scramble about to try to make sure that, we do have a steady supply of SIM cards coming in, right? Yes. And that's something that's, we do have a multi-vendor sourcing strategy, but this experience is almost kind of put a stamp or testified that we need to continue with a multi-vendor sourcing strategy. But it's not just the vendors, it's also keeping in mind the geographic location where they do this manufacturing with a preference for local sourcing. Have you seen any of that in your component manufacturing side of things as well?
Yes, we have. Simply by reading the global news, you'll hear lots of discussion about the desire for various geographies to increase fabrication capacity, increase semiconductor chip supply. As I think was said in the earlier session when the Minister, Mary Ng, was asked the question, the discussion about investing in fabrication technology is a big, longer-term investment, which is a very interesting discussion. It will be challenging to use that short-term. Having multiple suppliers in multiple geographies is simply about diversifying your supply chain, and that's key. From ARM's perspective, the key is that you think about who writes, and more importantly, who writes and who owns the software that runs on those multiple different electronics in the vehicle. And what we've seen, the change we've seen is as people look, as automotive car makers and tier one suppliers look at how they serve that how they better execute a multi-source strategy, they look at software portability between multiple different platforms from different vendors, sometimes based in different geographies. And that's really showing the significance of software portability, the desire to reuse that same software across multiple electronic suppliers, the same way you described for multiple eSIM suppliers. You would want that to minimize your investment, to have a multi-source strategy. And that's where working with companies like ARM brings you to a place where there's standardized components delivered to our silicon partners who then make differentiated products, but all actually have some underlying similarities that as a software developer, as an application developer, as a service provider, you can rely on those features being available in the hardware supplied by multiple vendors. That's a trend we're seeing throughout the industry.
Wow, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that ARM. I was aware that ARM definitely manufactured certain components and they had the IP, but I had no idea they connected partners and customers to a whole ecosystem of providers across those space, including software.
And ecosystem is a great word. And you mentioned it in your introduction about making sure, well, ensuring that products that you offer to vehicle OEMs are comparable, compatible, differentiated in certain areas, because differentiation is of course key, but some underlying commonality between yours and other products will ultimately help you be a supplier of choice into that automotive space. If you look at that from a what can the community out there in Canada do, I think it's exactly that. Look at how you become part of that automotive ecosystem where your innovation can lie, how you can look at building your own differentiated Ethernet controller, or differentiating the way your potential customers are re-looking at their automotive electronics. What can you as an innovator supply into that space? Because what we're seeing is vehicle OEMs are waking up to that, the importance of electronics, and looking around at their current and looking at new suppliers to make sure they can source the components they need, the electronics, the hardware they need, and the modules that encapsulate that hardware combined with software, to make sure they do have multiple suppliers from different geographies, from local geographies particularly, where they can have better control over their inventory that ultimately keeps their manufacture lines, keeps their vehicle manufacture lines flowing, while at the same time focusing on differentiation that they can bring to their vehicles to entice consumers on the forecourt. They've got a multi-pronged problem here, not just securing supply of the standard stuff, but also leapfrogging their competitors in terms of the experience, the connectivity, the services they deliver into that, as I sometimes think, the most complex Internet of Things device a consumer will buy.
Right. And from your experience, Tom, have you, I mean, since you have this insight into, strategic sourcing and planning for both yourself and your partners, have you noticed any specific trend in the kind of components or the kind of hardware devices or modules that, your customers or partners have been more interested in off late, so to speak?
Sure. I chuckle a little bit. The main observation is that vehicle OEMs are starting to realize quite how complex it is to have 70 or 100 ECUs in a modern vehicle, and that how, if any one of those individual components, the supply chain fails is the wrong word, has a pause, that can be production line stopped. And by having such a diverse set of components that feed into that process, that is now causing frustration. So what we're seeing is, as vehicle manufacturers, as part of the move to electrification, look at their vehicle architecture, the underlying electronic architecture of the vehicle, they are looking to have a smaller number in total of more complex devices that can be used and programmed through software in multiple ways. This means they're starting to insulate themselves against component shortages in one particular widget, because they have smaller numbers of unique components in the vehicle. Many of the components are more reusable, and their desire is to reuse them more. And then it becomes I can reprogram those ones through that same function, and I can get back to manufacturing with a less complex overall set of electronics in the vehicle, while still achieving new levels of functionality, new levels of differentiation, and more complex services over the air and over the air updates. It's a multi-pronged direction of travel towards more complex, higher value, lower numbers of electronics in the modern vehicle. So some of you will see this as called the move from discrete ECUs to domain architectures, and perhaps all the way towards zonal architectures. And it's a topic where ARM is well placed and working closely with vehicle manufacturers, with tier one suppliers, with silicon partners, with startups, with innovators, to help them understand the industry trends, to help understand how our partners can get into, grow into, jump into this opportunity. So it's a really interesting time.
Right. And I mean, we see, every other OEM every other week announcing that, starting from 2025, starting 2030, they will not be manufacturing, internal combustion engines anymore. So it's pretty clear that the future is electric. I mean, what do you see as some of the hurdles, other than what you've already mentioned about the complexity around number of ECUs, or even having very discrete architectures, sometimes same OEM having multiple discrete architectures for every, let's say, sub-brand or even vehicle model. What do you see as some of the other challenges in the hardware space in getting to this electric utopia? Because, I mean, internal combustion engine took hundreds of years to get to where we are today, right? I would say closest, we've almost perfected it, and now we're just pivoting to a completely different technology.
I agree. There's a myriad of challenges from, battery supply and raw materials and chemical and raw material supply for the manufacture of these new things, securing sourcing, securing supply of those, securing localized manufacture is key. You can go all the way the other way to vehicle infrastructure. How do you create an energy infrastructure to supply all of those electric vehicles? How do you manage it? How do you control it? How do you load balance? How do you make use of all that storage capacity? And we see different innovation happening in different geographies as they look at how the whole smart city emerges, where the cars plugged in overnight are part of that load balancing battery management type system. I think we'll see local solutions appear in that space as governments, as regulation impacts and affects and creates innovation for startups in those diverse areas.
Okay, I'm just gonna jump in here because I know we're gonna keep on going if I don't cut us off, but
Please.
well, thank you, Tim and Tarek, for that visionary discussion. Our audience is keen on getting some of their questions answered. I know we only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to start by asking, what have been the biggest challenges facing automotive OEMs in Canada as it relates to electronic hardware development and implementation? Obviously, from a component level, semiconductor supply chain issues have impacted production tremendously. Yeah. So what do you gentlemen think about that?
I'll take a stab and you can comment, Tarek. I mean,
sure.
The realization is that the manufacturing is all linked together. The realization has been it's a truly global market, but also the significance of those electronic components is in competition, in fabrication, in fab houses, with consumer electronics, with mobile phone technology, with others. So there's an element of realization there. The challenges are indeed having supply from multiple sources and making sure you see a path to managing those challenges, not just through keeping huge inventory, which is very expensive, through being able to move or have multiple supply chains in flow, I think is what people have observed. And the desire to bring certainly manufacturing to the US, and maybe even manufacturing to Canada, would be a longer term way to alleviate some of those challenges.
Right. Thanks, Ram. Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines. Full disclosure, I'm not very well versed into the hardware component sector within the OEMs, especially those in the US. I imagine they'd be sourcing most of their components globally, with electronic mostly, but with all the nuts and bolts coming from all over the place. But I think the biggest challenge they've had to face off late with the whole pandemic situation getting thrown into the picture is securing that sourcing. Because like you rightly mentioned, they're not necessarily competing with other manufacturing OEMs. They're potentially competing with even anybody who needs a chipset, be it a telecom provider or be it an electronics manufacturer. And I think part of the reason for the chip shortage of late is not just a couple of key factories catching fire, but this whole pandemic situation and the impact of the pandemic on the way we live our lives and the impact on the sudden demand for consumer electronics when everyone has to work from home, study from home, uh, and also the obvious impact on global supply chains and logistics. So it's hard to foresee something like a pandemic, but I think one way out for OEMs would be to find a way to secure their supply lines going forward. And like you mentioned, it could mean bringing manufacturing, or at least certain key components of manufacturing, back to more of a local sourcing model.
Mhm.
And it's a complex supply chain where it can and could be inventory of certain components and then into module design and manufacture, and that can be localized. So there's multiple steps on that journey, and I think there's certainly room for both innovation in that area and room for I think OEMs are taking a new look at how reliant they are on particular companies and looking for new players to enter that space to offer them diversity of supply.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to jump in, and we have one other question. I think we have time for one more. Software developers and leading technology companies are striving to create a unified, fully integrated, and highly personalized connected vehicle experience today. Auto industry analysts say that the potential of autonomous electrification and shared mobility trends can be completely realized through car connectivity. How close are we to this reality?
I'll let Tarek go from a
I can jump
reality.
in. I think it's still early days because, again, electrification is something we've only been seeing in the news right now. I think, we had one manufacturer that almost came out of nowhere and started leading the charge. And then you had the other OEMs look at them and look at the demand and even stock implications. And everyone's decided, hey, maybe this is a thing. Maybe this is what people want. And started pivoting towards that electrification. So I spent a good part of my days, weeks, and months talking to some of the product folks within these OEMs, and a lot of them in the past used, let's say, design or performance to actually make them unique about, why would a customer choose over the others, and now it's more around electrification and software and the experience for users within the vehicle. So I know a couple of OEMs that have done a much better job at it right now, but I think it's extremely fast paced. Everybody's playing catch up, and there's a lot of innovation we should expect in that space, not just in the OEM provided infrastructure, but I think typically that also opens up the window for aftermarket services. And that's also, I think, an area that startups within Canada can focus on, because at least in that world, they can focus more on getting end consumers products and services of value directly, rather than trying to knock on all these OEMs doors to try to get their product or hardware validated and inserted into that OEM ecosystem. That's a harder, say, bridge to cross.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think both those things you described are going to happen, both localized services and more ownership in the OEMs. I think some of the OEMs do recognize they're playing catch up in this area and will look to partner with technology companies, emerging innovative technology companies, to offer something different from their competitors. That creates an opportunity. One comment I would make is I don't think the entire move, I think there's multiple trends that can be overlaid. I personally feel that the truly autonomous vehicles is quite some way away. We can see a trajectory towards it, but it's a bit further out. The electronics capability of consumer vehicles, I firmly believe, is growing exponentially in the near years, and that will all be about connected services, connectivity, over-the-air updates, manufacturing, leasing, control of those services, and that's slightly disjoint from full autonomy. There'll be ADAS functions, there'll be driver assistance systems growing from what there is today. Autonomy, various levels of autonomy within certain geofenced areas is possible, but a bit further away from the mainstream consumers. But there's huge opportunity near term in the general move towards electronics and electrical systems in the vehicles.
Got it. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for Q&A. Tom and Tarek, I'll pass it over to you to wrap up today's discussion.
Right, Tom, I'll let you take the lead and I can just wrap up.
So I'm very pleased to have this chance to speak to a global audience and discuss and have a view on where innovation can happen. And I hope that the innovators of the future in Canada look to ARM, look at our various startup related programs, look at the way ARM systems and ARM products can be used in the ecosystem, are already being used. And we look forward to welcoming many more Canadian innovators into the ARM partnership family and promoting your products.
Perfect.
Thanks, Tom. And likewise, it's been a pleasure, folks. It's been an honor, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any other questions that remain unanswered. But as I see it, there's phenomenal change happening in the automotive industry, both near term and far term. And the possibilities are endless. There's new infrastructure and business models that need to be built. And a nascent cycle is about to start. And if the old adage of chaos is a ladder is to be believed, startups are the only organizations or the type of organizations that are nimble enough to reap the rewards during the early days. So good luck to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us in today's discussion on the intersection of hardware and autonomous vehicles. I hope to see you all back on FeedLoop at 12:55 for our second and final panel discussion of the day, inspiring the next generation of tech titans. Thank you all, and we'll see you later.